What separates a villain from a monster is intention. The Forgotten Realms has plenty of both, but the figures who have truly shaped the history of Faerûn are the ones who chose their darkness deliberately, sustained it across time, and left the world measurably worse for their presence. My criteria here is simple. Every character on this list originated in the Forgotten Realms. Each of them remained villainous across their arc, earning the title through sustained, deliberate villainy. For instance, characters like Jarlaxle or Artemis Entreri aren't really villains now, so I didn't include characters like that. I also took the gods off the table since it's pretty easy just to point to evil gods. I know there are many more worthy names than the ones I'm talking about today, but I'd argue that these are essential villains of the Forgotten Realms. Let's begin with the Mad Mage of Undermountain. Before Waterdeep became the City of Splendors, before the Yawning Portal drew adventurers from across the Sword Coast, there was a tower, and in that tower, or rather beneath it, lived a man the realms would come to know only as the Mad Mage. His name was once Halaster. Born within the ancient Imascari Empire, he rose to become one of the foremost archwizards, and when a fellow mage named Madriok the Ebenflame threatened to seize the empire for himself, it was Halaster who marched to face him, challenged him, and bound him within a demi-plane of imprisonment. He was celebrated, honored. He was by every measure a hero. The monster he became was a persona built little by little and corrupted across millennia. He changed his name to Halaster, deciding the grander title better suited a wizard of his ambitions. When he arrived at the base of Mount Waterdeep in 168 DR, 7 apprentices followed at his back, people who had committed their lives to learning from him, building alongside him, trusting him. He summoned beings from other planes to construct his tower, then sent those same creatures deeper into the earth, tunneling out what would become the most infamous dungeon in all of Faerûn. His apprentices watched their master disappear further and further into his obsessions. When they finally came searching for him, Halaster turned Undermountain's traps and monsters on them deliberately. He killed 2, he enslaved the rest to fortify his dungeon further. One escaped, Jacyra Kesselharp, who later became the Magister, and her accounts remain the primary source of what the realms know about the Mad Mage. The people closest to him, the ones he had mentored, became his first victims. He hunted the drow occupying the ancient underhalls beneath the mountain with extraplanar allies through the tunnels, trapped their souls for use in dark magic, and twisted the bodies of the survivors into slaves. When they had been fully wrung of their usefulness, he tunneled deeper, collecting even more, consuming anything in his path. 500 years later, in 668 DR, mages began vanishing across Corminthur and Myth Draenor. For a full decade, scholars and archwizards disappeared without explanation, pulled through Halaster's portals into Undermountain. His motive was petty by any measure, punishment against the guild that had been collecting monsters from his dungeon. Within Undermountain, Halaster appears as a tall, gaunt figure in tattered robes, muttering and chuckling to himself, his white hair framing a face that seems perpetually absent. Phantom images of him drift through the corridors. He rarely meets the gaze of those addressing him. The distraction is real, and it makes him more dangerous. Beneath it, he remains fully attentive, and he reacts to threats with complete clarity. His obsession with the dungeon runs deep enough that when he was kidnapped in 1369 DR, his absence alone destabilized Undermountain so severely that its gates began depositing monsters across the entire realms. The chaos didn't stop until he was returned. Halaster began as a man capable of heroism, someone who once stood between an empire and its destruction. He became something that treats sentient beings as collectibles, companions as variables, and the living world as raw material for his own entertainment. The dungeon is a monument to his ambition. He built it atop 1,000 years of torture, murder, and madness. Deep within the caverns of the Underdark, in a city built on betrayal and divine favor, longevity is the rarest currency of all. Matron Mother Yvonnel Baenre spent over 2,000 years accumulating it. Born 685 years before Dale Reckoning, she outlived every rival, every challenger, and even the silence of Loth that threatened to unmake her and her house. The Drow of Menzoberranzan would call her Yvonnel the Eternal, a title earned through an unprecedented lifespan, an iron will, and the sustained favor of the Spider Queen herself. For the Drow who lived through the Sable Years and Yvonnel's reign, Menzoberranzan and House Baenre were an untouchable institution. Unlike most elves, Yvonnel's nearly 2,000 years of life marked her visibly. Deep wrinkles cross-hatched her face, her hair had thinned to near nothing. At times, she used elixirs and glamours to appear more youthful, but mostly she left her face bare, letting the weight of centuries speak on her behalf. In Menzoberranzan, that kind of longevity inspires a particular sense of terror, and Yvonnel used this to communicate her dominance. Her favored instrument was a spider-headed wand, capable of casting vicious webs to bind an enemy or an insolent subordinate, a tool her son Jarlaxle also favors. She preferred to slowly poison her victims, taking great delight in their prolonged suffering. For those requiring even harsher lessons, she practiced skin stealing, removing a victim's skin 1 inch at a time, using acids and specially designed jagged knives. Cruelty for Yvonnel was purposeful. It punctuated her politics, further reinforcing her mastery over Lothian society. As first matron of House Baenre, she dismantled the ruling council from the inside through patience and precision and unspoken threats. Her long reach ran on information, illithids and humans employed across the Underdark to extend her sight. And her chief advisor, the mind flayer Mythal Viddenvelp, installed a hollow cut beside the council chamber so he could harvest thought from the room while debates unfolded. When rival houses fell, Yvonnel decided the fate of the survivors. The most promising and pliable among them found themselves inducted into the Baenre ranks. Yvonnel's mastery of Zenkarla, one of the Spider Queen's most demanding and macabre gifts, exceeded any other matron in the city's history. She had called upon it 3 times to raise undead warriors to her service. These rituals aged her each time, but her ambition and cruelty far outweighed any costs of vanity. When matron Malice Duerden failed to deliver Drizzt to the Spider Queen's altar, Yvonnel erased House Duerden almost entirely. When Kiorl Oblodra moved to seize the city during the God Silence, Loth returned and directed Yvonnel's hand, and she consigned the Oblodran compound to the Claw Rift. These were seismic acts executed with the certainty of a woman who had been the most dangerous person in every room she entered for over 2,000 years. Her grudge against Clan Battlehammer ran just as long. She had taken the founding king Gandalug's tooth as a trophy and transformed it into a prison in which she trapped and tortured the Dwarven king for centuries. When she finally marched, bringing House Baenre and nearly half the city against Mithril Hall, 6,000 troops followed her. But her ambitions overreached, and far from Loth City, Brunner Battlehammer struck her down. But her influence remained. By 1484 DR, her former advisor, the mind flayer Mythal Viddenvelp, used her remains to psychically harvest traces of her personality and memories and pass that essence to Yvonnel's daughter, Quinthel Baenre, and later to impart those memories into her granddaughter, the daughter of Gromph, Yvonnel the Twice Blessed. Even in death, Yvonnel's power remains, repurposed by the living, still shaping the house of evil she built. Most villains want power. Szass Tam wants to remake the world entirely, scrape it down to bone, and raise something new in his own image. He has been working toward that end for the better part of 4 centuries, and the failures along the way have done nothing to diminish his certainty. Born in 1104 DR, Tam built his early reputation in secrecy, operating under a false name, sponsoring adventuring companies to retrieve magical items on his behalf, then destroying those same companies before they could become inconvenient. He murdered his own mentor, took the man's crystal ball and spellbooks, reanimated the body as a skeleton, and sent it to patrol his halls. Practical, he would say, no body should go to waste. The Red Wizards of Thay breed ruthlessness, but Tam arrived with his already perfected. In 1157 DR, he led a faction of Red Wizards to kill the reigning Zulkir of Necromancy and claimed her title for himself. 2 years later, leading an invasion of Rashaman, he took mortal wounds on the battlefield and rose from them as a lich. Undeath didn't interrupt his ambitions, it funded them. Unlimited time, unlimited patience, an army that grows with every enemy killed. He does not quite look like what he is. Fine boned features, dark eyes, a wispy black beard, preserved by illusion and the preservation spell into the image of a scholarly man in his late 60s. But his withered hands give it away, and occasionally the faint smell of dry rot. Those who meet him in person consistently describe the same surprise. He is calm, measured, even pleasant. He treated a longtime chambermaid with genuine care for decades, and when she was killed by a rogue vampire, he incinerated the vampire on the spot. The capacity for loyalty is real in him. It simply shares space with everything else he is. His study stays dim, lit by candles with curtains drawn. He keeps his agents and servants deliberately compartmentalized, each one knowing only their piece of the design, none of them aware of who ultimately pulls the threads. Losing an ally costs him nothing. The realms, he has observed, are full of potential replacements. The scale of what he has attempted separates him from ordinary villainy. He redirected the Tujan horde against Rashaman through flattery and a staged demonstration of Thayan military power. He attempted to bind the demon lord El Tab into permanent servitude using two of the most powerful artifacts in Faerûn. He assassinated rival Zulkirs, engineered a civil war across Thay, and eventually seized the entire country, ruling as regent from the citadel at Thaymount, with undead legions tens of thousands strong. He made a bargain with Bane himself, surrendering his soul after 1,000 years in exchange for immediate military power because the timeline suited him. And when all of that proved insufficient, he built the Dread Rings, a network of fortresses designed to drain the souls of the living and fuel a ritual that would unmake the world and raise him to godhood. The ritual failed, but he began planning the next attempt before the smoke even cleared. Mystra and Azuth have reportedly forbidden even the Chosen from destroying him outright. The reasoning being Tam's magical inventions, the spells he originates, the rituals no one else could conceive, these are considered too valuable to lose along with him. The gods of magic have effectively decided that the most dangerous mind in Faerûn is worth preserving for what it produces. Tam, if he is aware of this, likely considers it confirmation. What makes Szass Tam one of the realm's most formidable villains is not any single act of cruelty or conquest, it is the refusal to stop. 4 centuries of failures, betrayals, and foiled rituals have produced not a diminished man, but a more determined one. Faerûn has never found a permanent answer to him, and Tam has never stopped looking for a permanent answer to Faerûn. Every villain needs a moment of fracture, a point where the trajectory of a life bends towards darkness and stays there. For Sammaster, that moment came from a single catastrophic act of good intention. Born in 800 DR, Sammaster was, by any measure, extraordinary. A fierce intellect and an obsessive drive to master magic carried him from apprenticeship under a traveling mage to archmage status by his mid-30s, a pace virtually unheard of in Faerûn. Mystra herself took notice. In 851 DR, she appeared to him in the Dalelands and offered him the mantle of Chosen. He fell to his knees and wept. He left that encounter convinced the goddess loved him. Elminster, who trained him in his new powers, watched the whole thing with quiet unease. He could already see where it was going. The turning point came when Sammaster encountered a Zentarum caravan holding slaves in cages. He attacked. In the chaos of the battle, his own magic killed many of the prisoners he was trying to save. The survivors, freed from the cages, refused to leave, too terrified of the man who had just slaughtered half the people around them. Sammaster collapsed from exertion. A harper carried him to safety. The master harpers were informed, but they chose to do nothing. That decision, the silence, broke something in him permanently, and what followed was slow corruption. A mage named Algashan Netheri befriended Sammaster and spent years feeding his bitterness, redirecting his grief outward onto everyone who had failed him: Mystra, Elminster, Illustrial, the Harpers. By 875 DR, Algashan had maneuvered Sammaster into attacking his former lover Illustrial in the Evermoors. 3 chosen responded. Mystra stripped Sammaster of his powers on the battlefield, and Algashan, who had arranged the ambush with full knowledge, was conveniently nowhere near it. What remained of Sammaster's sanity did not survive the day. What emerged from that wreckage was one of the most consequential religious movements in the history of Faerûn. Sammaster threw himself into translating ancient prophecies, arriving at a conviction that dead dragons were destined to rule Toril. He named his belief the Scaly Way. In 902 DR, he created the first Dracolich, a living dragon transformed into an undead worm through a necromantic ritual he had invented himself. He compiled the process into a text called the Tome of the Dragon, which spread across Faerûn and became the founding scripture of the Cult of the Dragon. The organization he built around this ideology has endured for centuries, drawing zealots, mages, and dragon worshippers into its ranks long after his death. And Sammaster has died more than once. Killed by an avatar of Lathander in 916 DR, he returned as a lich in 1282 DR. Destroyed again in 1285, he resurfaced in 1373, this time having bound his phylactery within the Draco Rage mythal itself, triggering a continent-wide dragon rage independent of the King-Killer star. He raised an army of orcs and giants under a false identity, seized the Bloodstone Gates, and flooded into Damara before being destroyed a third time. Each return arrives with a new scheme, a new army, and a wider reach. He keeps his essence housed in a soul gem, mirroring the Dracoliches he created, cycling between lich form and Dracolich form, each destruction buying only time. A man who wept at the feet of a goddess, a man whose attempt to free slaves killed them instead, a man who rebuilt that grief into a cult devoted to the dominion of the undead over the living. Sammaster is what happens when brilliance goes unmoored, and Faerûn has been paying for it ever since. Manshoon was born into tyranny and decided at a young age to be better at it than his father. His father, Haralshun, was the first lord of Zhentil Keep, a man who used power as a weapon against his own family. The lesson Manshoon took from that childhood was not resentment of cruelty, but a determination to sit at the top of it. When his father died, Manshoon killed his own brother Asmuth before returning home, ensuring his ascension to power was uncontested. He was still a young man at the time. Born in 1229 DR, he built his influence in Zhentil Keep through a combination of arcane mastery, manufactured loyalty, and calculated paranoia. He founded the Zentarum, the Black Network, in 1261 DR, shaping it into an instrument of trade, coercion, and surveillance that spread across the heartlands of Faerûn. He encouraged members to report on each other. He sent ambitious underlings on suicide missions to thin the ranks of potential rivals. He maintained alliances with beholders, manipulated the Church of Bane, and ran the entire operation behind layers of secrecy so dense that even his closest lieutenants were never certain who they were actually dealing with. Manshoon has seldom appeared without a mask, and even loyal lieutenants within the Black Network's inner circle were kept uncertain whether they were meeting the man himself, a clone, or someone in disguise. That uncertainty was not a byproduct of his methods, it was his method. He developed the stasis clone spell as his ultimate insurance, creating a dozen or more magical duplicates of himself to be awakened in the event of his death. In 1370, his trusted ally, Fazal Chimbrel, had him killed, and immediately found himself facing every one of those clones simultaneously, each convinced it was the original, each compelled to destroy the others. The conflicts that followed became known as the Manshoon Wars, a century-long series of battles between versions of the same man. 3 clones survived by developing the means to suppress the killing compulsion. The others destroyed each other across the realms. What followed is a history of resurfaces, reinventions, and refusals. One clone embedded himself within the Zentarum, another became a vampire and seized control of the Night Mask's Thieves Guild in Westgate, styling himself Night King. A third took refuge in Undermountain, where he eventually crossed paths with Halaster Blackcloak. The resulting duel cost Manshoon his left arm at the elbow, a wound that proved impossible to magically regenerate, leaving him with a mechanical prosthetic and a considerable grievance. He escaped, surfaced in Waterdeep, and began quietly positioning himself to seize the city, bribing and blackmailing masked lords, planning to displace the Open Lord, eliminate the Blackstaff, and rule as Wizard King. That plan failed, but he adjusted and resumed. Elminster has destroyed him more than once. Szass Tam's machinations have consumed his resources. The spell plague tore through his operations. Every version of Manshoon that has ever existed has been killed, dispersed, or dismantled, and the realms keep producing another one. His own words capture it best. "You have drowned me, burned me, hacked off my limbs, poisoned me, petrified me, and turned me to ash, and yet I live." What makes Manshoon one of Faerûn's great villains is the compounding nature of his evil. The Zentarum he built has outlasted every version of him, carrying the culture of treachery, surveillance, and exploitation he instilled into it across the centuries. His clones inherit his knowledge, his arrogance, and his ambitions, each one a continuation of a project that began with a young man pushing his blind brother off a bridge. The body count is incalculable, the organization endures, and somewhere in Faerûn, another Manshoon is already planning the next move. Some people are drawn to power by circumstance or trauma. Valindra Shadowmantle was drawn to it by pure, uncomplicated appetite. Born in the High Forest in 1225 DR, she left her Moon Elf community in 1322, frustrated by the pace of her education and uninterested in the obligations that came with it. She found a wizard in Mirabar willing to take her on as an apprentice, studied under him for a year, murdered him, and took his spellbooks. The pattern was established early: proximity, patience, extraction, disposal. She made her way to Luskan and the Arcane Brotherhood, where she spent decades earning trust and rank through precise, reliable work. By 1372, she had risen to Overwizard of the North Tower. When she was killed during a power struggle within the Host Tower, Arklum Greeth, the Archmage Arcane, and the closest thing she had to an ally, resurrected her. When the Host Tower itself fell, he transformed her into a Lich so they could rule Luskan together from the shadows. Her phylactery, supplied by Yvonnel Baenre, anchored her soul. The transition into undeath shattered her mind, leaving her still brilliant, but also volatile. Szass Tam recognized what she was and put her to use. As one of his primary agents in the north, Valindra became the instrument through which Thay's ambitions reached into the Sword Coast. She forged alliances within the Ashmedai cultus of Asmodeus and the aberrant Abolithic sovereignty. She studied the primordial Magera beneath Gauntlegrim with the intent to harness it for Tam. She worked to restore Thay's Dread Ring in Neverwinter Wood and lay the groundwork for a Thayan takeover of the city. She traveled to Chult to investigate the Soulmonger. She later nearly triggered a continent-wide rage of dragons by rushing the Cult of the Dragon's Dracolich Rite through a Netherese mythalar capable of amplifying it across every dragon in Faerûn. Her most consequential act came in Gauntlegrim in 1462, using a ruby scepter gifted by Szass Tam and the prayers of the Ashmedai. She summoned the pit fiend Bialti-Machu and turned it loose in the Forge City. Brunner Battlehammer, king of Mithril Hall, companion of Drizzt Do'Urden for over a century, died holding the devil at bay. Jarlaxle destroyed her body in the aftermath. Her phylactery, though, preserved her. She surfaced again, swearing vengeance against Drizzt, Jarlaxle, and Dalius and Fel. What makes Valindra genuinely dangerous is the combination of institutional knowledge and instability. She understands politics, alliances, and leverage as well as any archmage in the realms. The undeath removed whatever restraint once moderated her ambition. She operates with the recklessness of someone who considers herself nearly immortal, because she is, and the cunning of someone who has been navigating powerful, dangerous organizations since before most of her enemies were born. That brings us to the end of this video and who I think may be the greatest villains in the Forgotten Realms. Who do you think belongs on the list, and who is your favorite villain terrorizing Faerûn? If you love these videos and want to support the channel, check out the Drow Historian Patreon, where I do bonus content every single week. Your support helps keep the channel alive and growing. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next week for more lore from the Forgotten Realms and the Legend of Drizzt.